Hello, everyone, and I'd like to wish you a very, very warm welcome to day 2 of the Island Finance Forum 2023. Thank you all so much for joining in this session. My name is Stacey Alvarez de la Campa. I am the community manager here at Island Innovation. So I also want to let you know that I am based in Barbados, sunny Barbados, and I'm very excited to be here today. So Island Innovation is a global network and a creative agency, and we strive to advance innovation and drive sustainable change across island communities worldwide. So please visit islandinnovation.co to learn more about our network as well as our services. So I'm really happy to be presenting this session, and this session is called The Grass is Always Greener: Blue and Green Economy Investment Opportunities for Caribbean Large Ocean States, as I call them, rather than small island developed states. I think that the Caribbean provides a unique landscape to sustainably utilize that intersection that's at the heart of a thriving natural and beautiful biodiversity, and then the needs of our growing economies. And we're very much aware of that, particularly in the wake of the pandemic. So from Aruba to the Virgin Islands, and we have an environment across the Caribbean that really provides as kind of an incubator for blue and green economy projects. So I'm really excited for us to learn a bit more about all of the investment opportunities that are available and hear from our wonderful speakers. So before we begin, you should see a poll, which is going to appear on your screen, or it may have appeared already. And I'd really encourage you all to, answer the poll, click on the options, let us know where you're connecting from, the sector and the industry you belong to. And while you're doing that, please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat. I see people joining from our wonderful Caribbean region. We've got Jamaica in the house, Trinidad and Tobago. I know we have the Dominican Republic. We have Grenada. We have the Falkland Islands. Good to see some great international representation. Lagos Island. I know we have the Philippines in the house as well. So thank you all so much for joining. Okay. And Jamaica is there. Yes. Charleston, South Carolina, Vancouver, British Columbia. Thanks so much. Okay, so I can see now in terms of the results of the poll, it's great to see we do have a strong Caribbean contingent. I'm a bit biased because I like that because I'm based here. And that's closely followed by Europe and North America. Okay, and we see, however, representation from just about every territory. So that's fantastic. So thanks so much for letting us know where you're coming from. And remember also to let us know the sector that you represent. Okay, that would be awesome. I want to remind you as well to use the Q&A function for your questions. That would make it a lot easier for us to let the panelists and our speakers know exactly the questions that you have. Okay, so I'd also like to introduce our moderator today, who is no stranger to us, none other than our own CEO, Island Innovations, James Elsmore. So thanks so much, James, and I'll leave it over to you.
Thank you so much, Stacey. Really excited to be here for this session on blue and green economy investment opportunities for small island states, or as Stacey says, large ocean states. We do have a bit of a Caribbean focus in this session, but I'm sure much of what we'll be talking about today will be relevant to those of you joining from around the world in other island contexts as well. For this session, we are honored to be joined by Sabutu Schofield Caesar, the Minister of Agriculture, Forestry, Fisheries, Rural Transformation, Industry and Labor of St. Vincent and the Grenadines. Quite a few portfolios there to be juggling, but it's understandable how all of those things interlink. And so, Minister, I'll invite you to now come onto the stage to share the Vincentian perspective on these blue and green investment opportunities. Thank you for being here, and over to you.
Yes, thank you very much. And I wish to, first of all, show my appreciation to the organizers of this platform. It is of first importance that we have in our contemplation that to develop these islands and to transform the economies of the SIDS, that there is a need for a critical public-private partnership that is arranged, structured, and properly organized. In St. Vincent and the Grenadines, the country that I am going to use as the model for my presentation, we have witnessed over the past decade an exponential increase in production and productivity from the blue economy. And it came about by the strategic marketing of the blue economy resources in our country and the attraction of foreign direct investment. And it's very interesting that the foreign direct investment attracted to St. Vincent and the Grenadines, that it has come from other islands in the Caribbean. Within the landscape and the seascape of the Caribbean islands, we have significant potential. In St. Vincent and the Grenadines, in the OECS sub-region and also within CARICOM, we have a very large food import bill. And it is of first importance that when we're looking at strategic economic growth, when we're looking at innovation, we look at where the markets are. We have expended significant sums in investments touching on concerning building the requisite human resource capacity. We have, with of the government. So when we speak about innovation and the advancement of the entire political economy of small island states, we must first begin with an expression of the political will. Not only an expression of the political will, but there is a need for a strategic legislative framework which engenders the growth and development trajectory that we wish for the islands to be taken on. Then third and very important, we have to have the mobilization of the factors of production. There's the definite input from the state sector. There is the public sector. We have the non-state actors. And what we are seeing in St. Vincent and the Grenadines and in many other small islands, strategic relationship between the sector and the private sector. And fourthly, and of first importance, is the implementation process. In islands, we currently lack the ability to have the efficacious implementation of projects. And some of the human resource capacity needed would have to be brought into the country. And what we are doing here in St. Vincent and the Grenadines is to create a very careful blend between the indigenous knowledge and the indigenous information with that which is brought to the country. So it's basically 4 simple steps that I want to expose this morning. Firstly, it begins with the political will. Secondly, we must have the legislative frameworks in place. Thirdly, we have to ensure that we mobilize the factors of production, land, labor, and capital, and the implementation processes must be in place. That's my presentation this morning.
Thank you very much, Minister, for taking the time and sharing some insights into the situation in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. I'll now invite our next speaker, Sandiford Rule Edwards, who works as a consultant with the UN Food and Agriculture Organization and also the CARICOM Secretariat. Sandiford, over to you.
Thank you very much, James, for the introduction. And following from the Minister, let me just join with the colleagues to say it's an honor to be able to participate in this conversation in a private capacity, to share my own thoughts on this process. There are 4 things that I would quickly want to talk about in terms of the context, setting a little bit of the context for blue and green economy opportunities. What are some of these opportunities that I have seen, the challenges that are being faced, and fourthly, a quick approach to financing. So what is the context? And knowing that I don't have a significant amount of time, I will jump straight into it. We know that the oceans and seas covers around 3/4 of the planet's surface. For example, in the case of Grenada, which is 348 square miles of land, the exclusive economic zone is 26,000 square miles, which is around 74 times larger in terms of water as compared to land. When we speak of blue and green economy opportunities, this is consistent with the Sustainable Development Goals. For example, when we speak of SDG 14, which speaks to conserve and sustainably use the ocean, seas, and marine resources for sustainable development, looking at the size of our countries and knowing that we're surrounded by water, we believe that the blue and green economies can be a major catalyst towards the region's sustainable economic, but also socially cohesive development. We can't exclude that. The OECD estimates that by 2030, which is not far from now, basically 7 years from now, 6.5 years from now, the economic value to be attracted from the ocean-based activities that can be earned from ocean-based activities will approximate around $3 trillion and will employ over 40 million people. So when we think of that context, we think that especially small island developing states that are surrounded by water need to look at what are the opportunities, what are the investment opportunities. And there are some established industries that we are aware of, such as maritime and coastal tourism. It's an established industry. Maritime transport, marine businesses, services, dredging, maritime construction, shipbuilding, etc., shipping and ports. These are some of the established industries that we have worked with for a number of years that we've known, and we've done some significant investments in the region. But there are some emerging industries that I believe can shape the region's development going forward, and that can catalyze investment from investors, both domestic and foreign direct investors. And the first emerging industry that I quickly want to talk about is what is called the marine aquaculture. And the region imports close to $200 million in fish and fish products. It means that marine aquaculture is a space that we can look at to both drive investment that has the concomitant benefit of improving food security, reduction of food imports, improvement in unemployment, etc. There are only 4 countries. There are only 4 countries in CARICOM that can be considered to be net fish exporters. We're speaking of Belize, we're speaking of Guyana, the Bahamas, and St. Vincent and the Grenadines. All the other countries are typically net fish and fish product importers. So it suggests to us that there is a huge investment opportunity available around marine aquaculture. Marine biotechnology is an emerging space that I believe can catalyze investment. And we're speaking about research and development in healthcare, research and development in cosmetic products, looking at pharmaceuticals and nutraceuticals. A lot of these can be done. So developing some marine biology capacity is a space for investment. In the region now, sargassum, which has inundated the region, has been used in other parts of the world, in Puerto Rico and in other parts of the world, to look at cosmetics, to look at nutraceuticals. It's been used in the beauty and health sector. The region can do a substantial amount of work, or there is space for investment within marine biology. We also have carbon sequestration or blue economic opportunities for the regions, again, because we are surrounded by water. The use of not just our mangroves, but how can we use our seagrass bed, our seabed, to generate economic activity? How can we use it to raise resources from the international markets, for example, through the voluntary carbon market, to fund the development of the region? And there is a space that the private sector can play in that area, as well as our water, our coastal water. There is opportunity to use our coastal water through what can be called a water credits environment that fund the improvement in nearshore water and can result in significant benefits and opportunities. For example, improved livelihood for fishermen, better fish catch, better spawning, etc. Those are investment opportunities that are available. There is also available for what I call ocean renewable energy. Ocean renewable energy and using that in the mix of what can be considered to be the wave of green hydrogen and the interest in both blue and green hydrogen. Green hydrogen, the region imports over approximately $1 billion worth of fossil fuel annually. And so the ability to invest in ocean renewables, including green hydrogen, by the private sector can both be sustainable, but also have a positive impact on net foreign savings. Instead of having to spend such hard currency, 1 billion to import, it can also generate more local jobs and hopefully be able to generate what can be considered a more affordable fuel. The other area in terms of opportunity that is emerging in terms of the blue and green economy, particularly the blue economy, is around what I call marine education. You know, how can we integrate into our educational system, both from a technical and a vocational level, to allow for the development of scientists in research and development, but also to train people lower down in the value chain in terms of fisheries, in terms of underwater welding, looking at having a very strong boat repair program. We know that Trinidad and Jamaica is advanced in terms of ship repair, but countries such as St. Vincent, Grenada, they do substantial amount in terms of building boats, wooden boats. How can we improve education there? What about marine science and inclusion within our schools' educational system? So marine education, since we are surrounded by water, we can be the lead in terms of growing capacity, improving capacity, and enhancing capacity in the region. And then finally, another emerging opportunity is around what I call safety and surveillance. How can we use private investment to drive the development of better safety equipment, better surveillance equipment for ocean activities, and to have those be developed in the region? Since we are surrounded by all the water, how can we catalyze those investment? So what are the challenges as I move forward? There are some challenges around institutions, and that is from a private sector perspective. How do we catalyze private sector investment? There are three main challenges in my view that I think we need to consider. One, institutions. What are the clear policy framework in the region that exists to catalyze investment? And then how do we value marine resources? How do we put a valuation to marine resources that allows for the development of what I call very strong bankable projects or investment profiles? We need to also look at trained labor force. And again, the private sector can perform in that space. And then thirdly, the need for what I call a high-level regional cooperation around a strategy to share the resources. Because we are in one space, how do we have a strategy that can come together to attract foreign direct investments, attract domestic investments, without racing to the bottom and without dividing up the pie and wanting to approach it in silos? How we do it in an integrated space? Having regard to those three challenges, financing, I think there is a space for blended finance that brings together the private sector and the public sector, recognizing that governments are fiscal space is limited, and the declining aid flows that are coming from development assistance and partners. An approach using blended finance can work, recoverable grants, as well as having what I call special purpose vehicles that are led and administered by both the private sector and public sector in a joint manner, but is backed by the public sector to ensure that we can crowdfund people into that investment. In conclusion, I think that there are two critical things that the private sector across the board, private investors would have to consider. The first is ensuring that their proposals are feasible and sustainable, feasible from an environmental, social, and governance perspective, feasible from a financial perspective, that it's going to provide an adequate return so that it can be sustainable over time. And then secondly, I think it's important that the targeting of countries is important, that a one size fits all. There are countries where that would be better suited for emerging opportunities than others. I think that those are things that needs to be properly addressed in terms of private investors looking to deploy resources within the blue and the green economy space. I trust that I would have provided some food for thought. I thank you.
Thank you so much, Sandiford. That was very insightful. And actually, before I go to the next speaker, I wanted to ask you a question, if that's okay. You mentioned this idea of there's a race to the bottom in some, or this worry about a race to the bottom in some cases. And as most of our speakers here are from the Eastern Caribbean region, where you have a lot of smaller economies that may be in some ways fighting over smaller pots of investment and competing with each other. To what extent does the regional framework and organizations like CARICOM, OECS, help to ensure there is a collective voice, or do you still see that there is too much competition between different countries for this kind of investment in the Eastern Caribbean?
Right. So I would use an example of my former life when I was part of the Citizens by Investment program in Grenada. For example, the Citizens by Investment, you do find that at one point, most of the countries, all of which were the 5 countries in the region from the OECS, it appeared that they were all competing so intensely to raise investments from foreign direct high net worth individuals that their rates were being lowered drastically, and that was considered to be a race to the bottom. There is a similar, that similar philosophy can be transposed in the blue economy if we're not careful and if we do not have the right framework in place to ensure that we can collaborate where we need to and compete where we need to. The role of the OECS, and I think CARICOM is important. I think those 2 secretariats can bring countries together. Those 2 secretariats are able to leverage their convening powers. Those 2 secretariats are able to look at draft regional standards and frameworks that can then be used from a cost perspective. Is cheaper that you have one regional standard that then the countries can then use to develop their own framework. So I believe that there's a race, a role for those both secretariats, and would be useful to hear their thoughts and impact going forward. Yeah. Fantastic.
Thank you very much. We'll come back for some more discussion after the other speakers, but I'll move on next. Staying in the Eastern Caribbean region to Caitlin Carew, who is the founder of Helen's Daughters. It's a project that I have followed for some time now, and it's really amazing to see the work that you're doing in St. Lucia to empower women in agriculture. So Caitlin, looking forward to hearing your thoughts, and over to you. Oh, you're on mute. There we go.
Thank you so much, James. It's really an honor to be part of this panel. And I just really wanted to give the audience more of a visual of the grassroots interventions and obviously the areas of opportunity for investment within the sector. But I will focus more so on the green economy in particular. So just to give a bit about us, who is Helen's Daughters, what do we do, and so forth. We are a nonprofit organization that focuses on the economic empowerment of rural women through various capacities. One of them, obviously, is capacity development, market access, and introducing not only women agripreneurs, but the overall populace to new and modern agricultural techniques. Now, while we are a small organization, I believe that we have a small team, but a very big mandate. And obviously, we do work on a lot of intersecting themes from climate resilience and gender equality, especially in the agricultural sector. But first and foremost, we are concerned with putting money in the pockets of our female agripreneurs and, of course, creating wealth in rural communities as well. Now, without a doubt, the Caribbean, as we know it, although there's a large Caribbean contingency here, but to the rest of the world, the Caribbean is known for tourism. But what we've noticed in recent years is that trends have shown that the types of visitors and tourists that come to our shores are really focused on sustainability, on food and agritourism as well. Tourists now want to travel for a taste of the place in order to get a sense of the place. So how do we prepare our populations for this shift, for this investment, and for the changes in the demographics and the dynamics of the types of visitors that are coming to us? First and foremost, you can see that within the connections from our programs. The previous panelist mentioned investment in education and so forth, and that's one of the things that we have done. We have a scholarship program established with our local community college that funds 2 women who primarily study agricultural education or crop science. When you look at, for example, Brazil as a case in point, they invested heavily in science, technology, and innovation and education, obviously reversing their outlook as a previous net food importer, which St. Lucia currently is, and most of the Caribbean territories are. The water tank initiative. I know many persons think that, what's the big deal with water insecurity? But particularly with islands that will face and have the heaviest burden of dealing with climate change, and are really at the very forefront of it. Water security is quite essential, particularly when you work in agriculture. So what do? We essentially establish safety nets in the form of water tanks and so forth, where we provide water tanks, install them for women who are not able to do so themselves. In a sense, we look at it as working in the realm of climate resilience, being even more and more prepared for what climate change has for us. The agritourism tour is something that we started really recently. And it also was sparked because we have a collaboration with Hotel Chocolat on island, which I will go into in our agri apprenticeship program. But the agritourism tours, as I said, trends are really showing that persons, yes, they want to taste the local foods, but they also want to see where their foods come from and really experience our countries overall. And what we found is that typically farmers have been not able to access that sector, whether it's because they have no access to tour insurance or coverage, or they don't have, for example, the startup funding to be able to present their models as an agritourism. So in a sense, we've been working with a small group of women and have been successful in essentially retrofitting their farms to become agritourism tours, from providing water tanks, providing the creation of footpaths, toilets, basic necessities, and most of all, providing tour insurance as well, overall coverage, so that's thousands, tens of thousands of dollars that they wouldn't have to worry about. And finally, I think I'll touch on our farmers markets. Again, one of the biggest hurdles that we found in agricultural entrepreneurs was access to markets. So what do you do when you don't have an access to markets? You create one of your own. Our farmers market started essentially 7 months ago and have been quite popular. In the last 7 months, we've been able to generate $75,000 in sales, which all profits go to the farmers themselves. But it's really interesting to see the niche products that are coming out. Typically from a market, you think of produce and the typical things like honey and so forth. But in our markets, you are seeing those traditional items, but you're also seeing things like, for example, breadfruit waffles, dasheen flour, kombucha, locally made sauerkraut, dried mangoes. And these are things now that our hotels and restaurants are being exposed to. And we do have the advantage of being near cruise port, our market. So also our cruise visitors and other visitors on island are also being exposed to that, in a sense, gastronomic part of St. Lucia's tourism as well. The agri-apprenticeship program with Hotel Chocolat. This has never been done before. I would say partnership between a privately owned hotel and not the beauty of Hotel Chocolat is not only the hotel, but it's probably one of the most well-known chocolate brands, well, particularly in Europe. And a small nonprofit like us. And what we created was the first all-female agri-apprenticeship program on island that also doubles us up as a training space for our members as well. One, the apprenticeship program really we used and created a hybrid aquaponics space so that we could demonstrate climate resilience in a farm. And also two, again, one of the obstacles of attracting persons into the agricultural sector was the lack of training and the lack of obviously readily available and formal programs for young persons to enter into. And that is what the Agri Apprenticeship Program does. So we have 4 female apprentices currently, all between the ages of 18 to 23, 2 of which are our scholarship holders. So on top of being able to get their education fully funded, they are also having, while attending school, an actual experience in the agricultural sector. The hotel is a direct buyer of produce grown on property, and all produce is completely organic. And again, they match the cost from the salaries of our apprentices, along with establishing and building out the farm at Hotel Chocolat. And I think it's an opportunity that we hope to grow and grow from there, because it's really allowed us to jump over 2 obstacles. One, as I mentioned before, providing a training space for persons who are generally interested in agriculture, especially young women. And 2, access to land is such an issue in St. Lucia. And in general, it allowed us to be able to provide that space for them. And finally, I think that's our crown jewel very soon will be our collective farm. There's a myriad of issues in the agricultural sector, but as I said, there's a lot of investment opportunities. There's a huge demand for Caribbean foods. As I said, agritourism and food tourism is now becoming a trendy thing. But at the end of the day, how do we connect our populations to these current investment spaces? And this is why the collective farm is essentially going to try to bridge the gap. Continuing on with our training center, also providing an agro-processing unit so that we can support more of the women who are already at our farmers markets to access regional and international markets as well. Creating a cafe, because we do plan on doing agritourism exchanges as well, so that there is a space for our women to showcase their products and so forth. And finally, I think, with opportunities, there are always challenges. I mentioned quite a bit of the investment areas, but I think one of the biggest challenges, aside from access to markets, is access to easy banking and insurance. And I think there is a huge space for mobile payment solutions in the Caribbean. It's definitely not an easy thing to deal with. But I think the financial sector, as a previous moderator panelist mentioned, looking at things, for example, like angel investment, impact investment, recoverable grants, in my opinion, even, for example, developmental fellowships that can assist agripreneurs or persons in the agritourism or food tourism sectors. So, as I said, there are many challenges, but there are also many opportunities. So thank you once again for the opportunity, and I look forward to hearing from the next presenter.
Thank you so much, Keithlin, for that really insightful presentation. While I have you, one of the issues that we've talked about a lot is the cost of money for small island states, meaning that the cost for small businesses, farmers, is actually very high often to get the investments that they need to grow their businesses. And from the perspective of the farmers that you work with, what kind of investments do they need to grow their businesses? Do you see and do you see the availability there to help them?
I see the availability there, but to be honest with you, I think there needs to be a revolution in our finance sector. Right now, I'm a bit concerned because I'm seeing quite a bit of loan sharking agencies popping up and taking advantage of what banks are essentially providing obstacles to, because essentially agripreneur goes to a bank and naturally we know you're not going to get the loan. And a loan shark opens up and provides you with access to the money, but at 18 to 24%. And our populations are getting stuck in basically grabbing onto that. You are seeing a lot of really innovative and helpful financial solutions, like, for example, Massey supermarkets with their farmers. There's a no interest loan program. So they basically pay off with their contracts. And that's something that we are looking into. I'll be honest with you, we have approached financial service agencies and said, look, we're going to provide $50,000 and we just want you to administer the loan, but we also want to design who you lend to and how you lend. And we've never gotten any uptake from that. So it just kind of shows you, I think that our banking sector is very traditional. Granted, there are some other loopholes, but I definitely think that we do need to explore some more innovative financing, because 5,000 EC, 10,000 EC can go a long way, but our agripreneurs don't even have access to that.
Absolutely. Okay, very, very interesting. We'll come back to that in the discussion. We'll go now to our last speaker. I'd like to invite Ian Mills to join us. He is the Deputy Development Director of UK Aid in the Caribbean, and also the UK Alternate Director for the Caribbean Development Bank. And we invited Ian to this panel specifically in this discussion because it's absolutely critical when looking at the investment space in regions like the Caribbean to understand the role of aid and also the role of government agencies when it comes to this. So I think it adds an interesting perspective on the discussion. And Ian, we'll hand over to you.
Great, thank you all for having me. So I'd like to touch on three parts of this topic. So the first is just a quick reminder of some of the constraints to investment in the region, which I think we're very well versed in, but I think it's good to start with that. Before then looking at some of the work that is ongoing at helping to address some of those constraints. And then thirdly, the reflections on the emerging investment opportunities in both the blue and green economy in the region, while noting I'm not an investment advisor. So firstly, a reminder of key investment constraints. So really across the three main areas: so economic constraints, the low economies of scale with small countries, high costs of borrowing, limited trade integration, and the heavy reliance on tourism affecting competitiveness of other sectors. Environmental constraints to investment, so the growing frequency and cost of natural disasters, limited access to climate finance in practice, whether it be because of capacity constraints in accessing it or because of complexities with the global fund structures. And of course, plenty more work needed on climate adaptation to help de-risk incoming finance. And then thirdly, social constraints to investment. So the significant outward migration in the region, high inequalities, and violence and crime to varying extents. So those would just be my first observations on some of the things holding back investment in the region. So what are the types of things that are being done at the moment to enhance the investment climate? And I can talk from the UK's contribution in that regard. A couple I would point to would be a lot of money going into climate resilient infrastructure. So the UK is actually putting in about £350 million of grant funding into climate resilient infrastructure in the Caribbean, be it roads, for example, in Antigua, Belize, Guyana, St. Lucia, and other places, or modernizing ports in St. Vincent and Montserrat, or water supply projects, or agricultural developments in Jamaica. And it's not for the sake of infrastructure, but it's really as an enabling backbone for then inclusive economic growth. And other types of initiatives as well that are trying to enhance the investment climate, I would point to Compete Caribbean as a particularly interesting one. And so that helps both the regulatory environment, so working with governments on business environment regulations, but also on clusters support for key sectors. And for example, not long ago, they did a Blue Economy Challenge Fund to basically put a challenge out there to say, can we get innovation specifically helping the blue economy that we can support? And then of course, and I come from the aid perspective, we then have support at the macro level, supporting governments with building resilience, whether it's through disaster risk finance instruments or accessing climate finance better, to the micro level of supporting people on skills development and with health and building climate resilient hospitals. So all that hopefully is helping to improve the climate, the investment climate of the region. But I think that then moves us on to the third part of the question, is then saying, well, specifically what might be some of the reflections on emerging opportunities in the green and blue economy space. The first I'd point to is of course in renewable energy. So it's crazy that over 80% of energy use in the Caribbean comes from imported fossil fuels. And of course, the cost of electricity in this region is also extremely high. And there is a lot of potential in wind, in solar, and in geothermal. So we know that it's not a shortage of sun or a shortage of wind that's a problem, but of course it's about the level of sophistication in regulations, in power purchase agreements, in insurance, and even in regional cooperation. So when looking at the potential of offshore wind, which is particularly exciting, that of course would require a regional approach. Then of course with things like geothermal, really exciting that there's already been exploratory drilling, and the UK has also helped to de-risk that. But of course, and examples like Dominica, but of course it then needs the private sector to come in and take advantage of that, which is hopefully the direction of travel. And green hydrogen was mentioned, a really exciting area globally. And I think this region has plenty to learn from, and I think countries that are particularly well placed to help develop that agenda further, such as Trinidad. In fisheries, another area to mention, again, crazy that the majority of small islands in this region are net fish importers. So over 70% of the world's fish stocks are already fully exploited and overfished. And so clearly there is potential for the fishing industry to adopt more sustainable fishing practices, aquaculture that was mentioned, particularly exciting, and value-added products. So this helps both with local livelihoods, but also with food security, which is a really big problem in the Caribbean. In coastal tourism, so enhancing the sustainability aspects of coastal tourism, so with a greater focus on ecotourism. So we heard yesterday from Avinash Prasad how potentially changing the tax structure to the shipping industry could generate revenue that could be used for climate adaptation. And I think that type of thinking around the tourism industry is also a really interesting area to explore further. And then there's the slightly more innovative areas of blue carbon initiatives. So clearly there's a lot of public sector interests in trapping more carbon in the sea, but there can also be some private interest in doing that. So for example, mangrove restoration, which is another area that we've been supporting in Jamaica, is really helpful for the local communities, and actually linked to a previous point can really help build up fish stocks as well. And then of course in new technology development, so water resource management, not just for the Caribbean, but technologies around water desalination and reuse technologies. And then finally in climate smart agriculture. So there's opportunity in this region for niche areas. So historically it was an area that focused more on sugar and bananas, but given the low economies of scale and high costs, it's really that comparative advantage is shifting more into the niche products such as organic, high value added vegetables, spices, coffees, oils. But again, because the increasing frequency and cost of natural disasters, it really puts a big emphasis on things like crop insurance being critical for SMEs being able to grow and become exporters. So I think I'll end with mentioning a couple other things. That the UK doesn't only try help in the enabling environment of investment climate, but also is a direct actor in a number of ways. So we actually have the UK Development Finance Corporation called British International Investments that loans has loan instruments and is spending over £7 billion over the next few years globally. And just a few months ago announced its investment into a private equity fund in Jamaica focused on CARICOM SMEs, and in its work will have a natural focus on the climate agenda as well. So I think that's a particularly interesting approach, particularly in a world of scarce resources, pressure on ODA budgets, the scope for investing hand in hand is really there. And then of course the role of all the private sector. So actually just last month, the UK announced a new green finance strategy, recognizing the important role for the financial sector, the City of London, in helping to catalyze more finance and promote private sector investments for the green transition. And then of course, lastly to mention, of course, this region has and should take further advantage of preferential trade agreements, whether it's with the UK, EU, US, or even amongst itself with CARICOM. So I think there's a number of private sector interests that can really help this agenda when thinking about areas for investment in the blue and green economies. So hopefully that's food for thought, both on the challenges, ongoing work, and some reflections on opportunities. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ian. And I will welcome the other panelists to turn on your cameras to start the discussion. And as you're doing that, maybe start off with a question for you, Ian, on the role of government agencies or government aid funding like yourselves in facilitating private sector investment. So you made a comment about this, was it the Green Fund, new Green Fund, Green Strategy, which facilitates that? How do international government organizations help to drive or work together with the more private side of investment?
Great, yeah, great question. So we use aid money to both in programs, but then we also, of course, put money through multilateral banks, whether it's the World Bank, IMF, Caribbean Development Bank, and we have roles on the boards through those organizations and through that we're able to help influence and contribute to. So there is a role for programs with grant money in ODA eligible countries, but actually in a world where that's a scarce resource, there is a lot of thought going into how can we stretch the balance sheets and the impact of multilateral banks to get wider impact, and what type of instruments do we have that aren't just grants, that are development finance, that are below commercial return levels, but have some concessionality in them. So that's really the direction of travel. And then, of course, I think, like Avinash mentioned the other day, helping on the global level on some issues such as access to finance that are critical for SIDS. Typically, SIDS, a lot of them have, having high GNI per capita and not being able to access concessional finance, yet being very vulnerable, and trying to help that global agenda around recognizing vulnerabilities to climate and taking that into account into the future. So I think it's both the policy level as well as the ODA financing level, as well as influencing through a lot of the partners that we have roles on. Thanks.
Thank you very much. So we have about 10 minutes or so for questions, and there's two main areas that I think we can, or maybe three if we have time, to focus on. The agriculture sector in the region, which I think is critical. Blue economy has come up a few times, and then maybe also the circular economy. Of course, all these things are related to some extent. And there were a few questions about the agriculture sector in the region and the specific challenges in developing agribusiness. And Sandifer, maybe we can start with you on this, but it's often very hard for agribusinesses or small farmers, large farmers to compete with imported foods coming from the US and other reasons. And it would be good to explore a little bit why that is when we're having this conversation about investment, and maybe what some of, and I'm not expecting you to solve this immediately, of course, but what some of the opportunities that are there to try and make the sector more competitive in the smaller countries in the region.
Yeah, recognizing we only have 10 minutes, I would have to do this in 2 minutes. I think two quick things that we often ignore is that the region's agricultural sector developed on a monocropping system, particularly with exports into the colonial powers, particularly into Europe, sugarcane, rice, etc. So you found that over a lot of years, the infrastructure of agriculture was based on an export rather than self-sufficiency. That's one. The second thing is that the region has also not transitioned as it relates to the agricultural revolution and improvements. We have not transitioned. We remain, sort of static in terms of the use of the same practices and etc. And then there's a matter of scale. In the US, the agriculture is subsidized, while they have millions of acres that they're farming. It is heavily subsidized. So you find that to be able to compete might be difficult. But Having said that, there are pockets of opportunities. There are areas where there are things that we can do, and we can do sustainably, and we can do successfully. So for example, in the area of vegetables, niche vegetables, the region can do well. A lettuce that is grown in the region is going to be way fresher than one that comes from Latin America or comes from Mexico. I think to be able to advance our sector quickly, three things. We need to look at how can we infuse more technology, more precision technology, more artificial intelligence in pest and management, more data, more improvement in growing techniques to reduce cost. I think we have to also look at procurement. How can the government as well, be a part, because the government purchases a lot of food for schools, hospitals, prisons, etc. And being able to include that in the demand is going to help. And I think thirdly, looking at education around financing. So for example, how many of our financial institutions, the credit officers, understand agricultural lending? Most of them is salaried. If you have work and you have a salary at the end of the month, it's easy to get financing. If it's agriculture, lending to lettuce is totally different from lending into cows. So I think those are things that we need to look at to be able to advance the sector forward.
Thank you, Sandiford. And there's a lot of interesting questions and comments coming in. I'm trying to keep an eye on some of those. One that I wanted to read out, which I thought was particularly interesting, came from Nicole Chamier, who is the former chief economist of St. Helena, and highlighted that the problem of St. Helena was summarized with being too small for international banks to be interested. Secondly, financiers for PPAs wanting government guarantees, which they weren't able to provide. And thirdly, not being able to bid for funds from development banks as an overseas territory. And I think that's was an issue that was also highlighted in the opening speech by the governor of Guam, Guam being a US territory, and not being able to access certain funds due to their political status. This is really interesting that a lot of islands that may fall into certain political status and not being independent states don't have the same access to funds as independent states, and that's something to be explored further. Keithlin, after Sandiford's comments about the agricultural sector and some of the challenges there, I was wondering if you had anything else there to add, and if you could maybe comment also on the efforts to cooperatize, if that's a word, or to build cooperatives between farmers to help add some security, I guess, in their businesses.
Thanks, James. I will start off with the first question, the last question on cooperatives. For me in particular, and here in St. Lucia, cooperatives is almost like a bad word, because most have failed. Most have been riddled with cases of corruption or allegation of mismanagement of funds and so forth. So typically, particularly the older sector, they're not keen on it. With us at Helen's Daughters, we use the word collective. Very similar styles in a lot of ways, but it's really a mindset shift, because I think that there's almost a trauma from the past when it comes to cooperatives and how farmers have basically gone through those types of structures and they don't trust them, essentially. And then when it comes to your previous question and also what Sandiford referred to, I think one of the key things with the Caribbean, I will be an eternal optimist in that while we are not large economies, I do think that we have an opportunity to focus and dominate on quality rather than quantity. I think there's a lot of things that set apart Caribbean foods and so forth as the only thing that persons can eat, touch, and so forth in the world. And I think there is obviously an added advantage to that. And I think that's a way of basically rejigging our mindsets towards performing at scale.
I think those observations are very interesting. There's definitely a need there to integrate the tourism sector and the agriculture sector, which is it seems like a relatively new thing in a lot of the region. And I know there are challenges there as well in terms of providing the consistency and other things. So I think the work that you're doing around that to build that relationship with the tourism industry is really, really critical. And it really mirrors our philosophy that when we're looking at sustainable development and investment in sustainable development, you can't look at tourism or agriculture or transportation in isolation, especially in a small island context. Moving on to you, Ian, I believe you mentioned blue economy a few times in your intervention, and I'd be curious to know more from a UK government perspective and in terms of investment in that sector. What is the approach? I've found that blue economy can often mean different things to different people. It's certainly a huge growth area and very relevant to islands, but what does it mean in the context of your work?
Thanks. I mean, the context of my work, I mean, my primary objective is poverty reduction. So, and in the Caribbean, that's really about building climate resilience. And so I think the lens that we would have on it is the importance of the blue economy for building resilience and poverty reduction. I mean, as mentioned, it's a very big space. So from the maritime industry to the coastal tourism to so many different aspects. And I think it also has different interventions there, whether it's small programs, grant programs, or whether it's sort of global R&D. So I think it's an area. There's probably a number of different sort of prongs that we come at it from, but really from a UK perspective in this region, it would be you know, how do we work with that to reduce poverty? How do we work with it to strengthen trade amongst the region and with us ourselves? And how do we leverage global technological advances in this area? You know, I did point out the fisheries and the fish stocks, and aquaculture was mentioned from Sanderford, all really interesting areas. Mangrove restoration. So these are all. It's a big space, but a lot of things that we have interest in and interest in supporting.
Fantastic, thank you. Well, I'll go to each of you one last time for some closing remarks. And just as I'm doing that, there were some other interesting comments coming in. A comment from Dominique in Guadeloupe saying, again, a specific situation in Guadeloupe as a French territory, they do have the benefit of access to European funds and French funds and what that brings, but also as a French territory, they're cut off from some of the challenges or for some of the opportunities to collaborate with other islands in the region and still facing similar challenges. I think there was another question which I've lost, which I would open up to any of you in your final comments, was also advice for entrepreneurs or small medium enterprises that are looking to get more investment and to attract investment. There's a challenge that has come up a lot for smaller businesses. What advice, if you have any in your closing remarks, you might have for businesses working on green or blue topics that are looking to attract investment, of how they can build that? And also, if there are, to your knowledge, not just private investment opportunities, but government grants or funding or other opportunities looking to support businesses building in that sector. So we'll go to each of you for final comments. So Sanderford first.
Thank you, James. I think this was a very rich conversation. I've learned quite a lot from my colleagues, Ian and Kathleen. In terms of closing, one of the questions that was raised had to do with funding startups, and right there I came up with the Caribbean Startup Initiative, where resources can really be pumped into startups in the blue economy, the green economy, and other sectors with specific reference on disadvantage or the smaller countries. The Jamaicas and the bigger country may have such resources available, but especially the OECS and small island developing states may have a challenge. So a Caribbean or a small island startup initiative that funds investment opportunities, that has very strong bankable proposal, but they don't have a source of funding to kickstart. I think it's useful. We can leverage venture capital, pension funds, private sector, backed by government seed capital. So I believe that the sky is no longer the limit, that opportunities can be found in every crisis. And I think this, despite the challenges that are faced in terms of funding blue and green initiative, once we remain committed and sticking to it and ponging on those, then opportunities are going to come to hand for some of those investors. Yeah, thank you for the opportunity to share.
Great. Can I just come in straight away? I think, and thank you, Sandiford, as well. A really rich conversation. I think I'd point out, I mean, there is a global challenge with how you grow a startup and at what stage of finance you need from where as you grow. So it is a problem. But I would point to Compete Caribbean that does challenge funds in certain areas. So that's one to look out for. And also it works with clusters in sort of bringing sectors together to try increase their ability to work well together. I'd also point out IDB Invest, depending on the size of an SME, and also CEIF, which is the private equity fund I mentioned, the British International Investment puts money into for the Caribbean, focused on SMEs. So that's SEAF. But again, that might be a bit more towards the private equity size rather than sort of micro. So it's a natural growth challenge, but I think those would be pointers at where I'd suggest to start looking. Thanks.
Thank you, Ian. And Keithlin, we'll leave the last word to you.
Thanks so much, James. And again, it was an honor to be on this panel. Really learned a lot from my fellow panelists. It's just something I really wanted to add is oftentimes we really talk about policies and, you know, this cookie cutter strategy on how we can provide access to finance and so forth. But while we talk about investment, it needs to be sustainable investment, and it also needs to touch the persons that need it the most. And also talking about startup funding and capital, usually, I mean, you find that, especially in the agricultural sector, persons that lack perhaps the necessary education or perhaps don't understand the terminology, the types of words and stuff that funders are looking for, they are usually left out just because of that lack of education. So how are we really trying to target the most marginalized in being able to access this, or in a sense, upskill them to teach them how to access these funds? So I think that's something that also needs to be looked at aside from just establishing certain funds. And I think finally for me, when it comes to entrepreneurs, particularly social entrepreneurs, it's look outside of you know, our islands. For me in particular, the Ashoka Foundation, Echoing Green. There's other foundations like Draper Richards Kaplan as well that are, I mean, I'm still funded on a fellowship to run my organization. So these are things that we can look at. And starting up, I use crowd funding as well. All of these little, you know, instruments that perhaps I couldn't get grants, so I went another route. So the world is our oyster, particularly the internet. So use it wisely.
And definitely would echo the Echoing Green and Ashoka and the fellowships like that are a fantastic opportunity for people building programs in this sector. And I think maybe there's a need for programs like that specific to the Caribbean region to support entrepreneurs. So if anyone's looking to fund a project like that, let's explore that opportunity, because it would be a fantastic boost for, as these programs often are very global in focus. And so people in the Caribbean region often find it harder to access them, although there are some that are available, as Keithlin mentioned, for the region. Well, thank you to our panelists. I'll hand over to my colleague, Stacey Alvarez, to wrap up and share an exciting opportunity for anyone who is interested in these topics to join us in person to discuss them.
Yes, thanks so much, James. Well, definitely a heartfelt thanks so much to all of our panelists. This was such a rich and engaging discussion. And thanks so much, James. Thank you to our keynote speaker, the Honorable Sabato Schofield Caesar from the Ministry of Agriculture, Forestry, Fisheries, Rural Transformation, Industry and Labor of St. Vincent. I'm glad he made it here. That's my homeland. I was there about a month ago for a birthday, so it was great to see representation from there. Thank you so much, Sandiford Rule Edwards. Your role as a consultant, you really brought, I think, a lot of thought-provoking discussions and solutions to the forum. Keithlin, everyone I know in the chat was so inspired by your project, what you're doing to help bridge that intersection between women and access to the bounty that agriculture and farming can provide for a community. Thanks for that. And thank you so much, Ian, for providing that. You kind of rounded everything up and let us know we can see all of the viewpoints that we got to enjoy today, and that really going to shape our purpose. So I want to make mention, as James said, a special upcoming in-person event that's being held in Madeira in Portugal, June 22nd to 23rd. You can be part of the conversation about building the blue economy for the future. This is our Blue Economy Investment Forum. So tickets are now available. I know it's been in the chat that you can check the chat and you'll see the link. You can get tickets, but a special mention, we have a special discount code IFF 2023, and you'll get 50% off those of you who book your tickets before the end of the Island Finance Forum. So this is a great way to continue the conversations that were raised during the Finance Forum. So we hope to see you in our next session, which is going to be at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, kind of New York, Barbados time, 9 in the evening in London, and it will be 6 a.m. the next day in Sydney. This is our lovely, we have a cool networking session. We can see the importance of building connections and networking through the chat, and this is a way to continue this. So that's later today. So please, I encourage you to join. It'd be great if you also followed our Instagram. We have our new Instagram at _Island Innovation. That's our new page. The other one is not active right now. So we really hope to see you later in our networking session. And also we have a feedback form. There's a link to a feedback form that's going to be coming up as well. So once again, thanks so much to everyone. My mind is blown by how much I learn every time I'm here, and with Island Innovation, and every time we have one of these sessions, I learn more and more. Thanks so much to the panelists. Thanks so much, James. And I will see you all in the next session. Bye, everybody.
Everyone. Bye-bye.
All right, everybody.
Bye.